Homophobia in the country. Rurality is regularly associated with conservative, religious, and sometimes prejudicial attitudes and beliefs. Although this is what's believed, we haven't had a lot of research focused on LGBTQ attitudes among rural Americans. Since over 80% of Americans live in cities or suburbs, that's why there isn't much research done on the stigmatization of LGBTQ people in rural America. This current study will examine the relationships between rurality and attitudes toward the LGBTQ through a test of norm-centered stigma theory, with a focus on hetero-cis normativity and intersecting experiences with social power using data from a sample of U.S. adults ages 18 to 64, stratified by the U.S. Census categories of age, gender, race/ethnicity, and census regions collected from online panelists. The study highlights the reasons for hostilities directed towards queer people so that hopefully such negativities can be erased. Researchers have found that rural and urban people differ when it comes to values, attitudes, and behaviors. We also see that rural people participate in traditional behaviors and typically have more conservative attitudes. While there are many differences between urban and rural people, we're going to focus mainly on the stigmatization of queer people among rural Americans. In the U.S., rural people are more likely to be Republican than urban residents. This has been more prominent in recent decades. Research also shows that rural Americans are more likely to be associated with religious rights in Christian nationalism. People in rural areas are also more likely to be opposed to abortion, same-sex marriages, show resistance towards female leaders, approve of reducing immigration, and exhibit higher rates of racial resentment compared to urban Americans. It is also more likely that rural men support conservative attitudes about masculinity. Recent research shows that rurality is significantly related to stigma towards queer people among U.S. adults. For example, a recent meta-analysis investigating attitudes toward bisexuality found in lower population density / rural areas was related to a negative attitude toward bisexual individuals. Another study found that residents living in small towns had the least supportive attitudes towards bisexual men and women in comparison to those in large cities, small cities, and suburbs. A small-scale college student study showed that students who grew up in rural areas were less supportive towards bisexual people than students who grew up in suburb or urban areas. Another small student study conducted in eastern Kentucky showed that growing up in rural locations was related to greater discomfort with homosexuality. Many studies show that cisgendered women are more supportive towards queer people when compared to cisgender men. And only one study that could be located talked explicitly about gender differences among rural Americans in the aspect of queer attitudes. It found that men residing in farm/rural areas had the lowest level of support for transgender people in comparison to men and women residing in larger cities, small cities, suburbs, and small towns. However, it shows that gender differences when comparing men and women didn't statistically differ between rural people compared to people residing in large cities, suburbs, and small towns. They suggest that more research needs to be done to better understand the relationship between gender, rurality, and queer attitudes. We will focus on norm-centered stigma theory for the study. It is an ideal theoretic framework to analyze the relationship between gender, rurality, and attitudes toward queer groups because it focuses on the importance of norms/norm violations, social powers, and interactions among these. The idea of hetero-cis normativity is particularly is essential in the current city because it states that homosexuality and cisgender people are individuals who are quote-unquote normal, and therefore it is acceptable to express negativity, prejudice, and discrimination towards non-cisgender and or non-heterosexual people because they're quote-unquote not normal, and specifically, they are norm violators. The NCST is outlined as follows. There are 3 tenets of the NCST defined. A theoretical medical model of the NCST is provided, and the hypotheses derived from the NCST are offered and are discussed in detail in the following selections. NCST Tenet 1. There is a culturally dependent and reciprocal relationship between the norms and the stigma. For this study, Tenet 1 is as follows. There is a cultural dependent relationship between violations of hetero-cis normativity and LGBTQ stigma. Tenet 2. The relationship between norms and stigma is associated by social power dynamics between the stigmatized and the stigmatizers. For the study, Tenet 2 is as follows. The relationship between violations of hetero-cis normativity and LGBTQ stigma is organized by its social power experiences of cis men and cis women. NCST Tenet 3 is stigma is inclusive of negativity and social sanctions directed towards norm violations and norm violators, justified through social power dynamics. For this study, Tenet 3 is as followed. LGBTQ stigma is inclusive of negativity and social sanctions directed towards the violations and violators of hetero-cis normativity, justified through social power dynamics of gender. From this, the study came up with 3 different hypotheses. Hypothesis 1, there is a significant positive relationship between hetero-cis normativity and the LGBTQ stigma scales. Hypothesis 2A, the relationship between hetero-cis normativity and the LGBTQ stigma scales is moderated by interactions between hetero-cis normativity and the access of social power. Hypothesis 2B, the relationship between hetero-cis normativity and the LGBTQ stigma scales is moderated by interactions among axes of social power and rurality. The data for the study comes from the 2018 LGBTQ and hetero-cis population study collected by using online panels recruited from more than 5 million U.S. panel participants who work with the Survey Sampling International, SSI. For this study, a sample of U.S. adults ages 18 to 64 stratified by the U.S. Census categories of age, gender, ethnicity, and census reasons were gathered by the SSI. The first sample included a total of 36,466 email invites sent out to only heterosexual/cisgendered potential respondents, meeting a requested quota of 1,500 respondents. The second sample included a total of 103,001 email invites sent to only LGBTQ potential respondents, meeting a quota of 1,520 respondents. And here in the table, we can see those statistics laid out more defined by the regions, sexual identity, and race and ethnicity. For the study, there is dependent variables and independent variables. Dependent variables would be LGBTQ stigma scales. The study uses Wharton's LGBTQ stigma scales, which includes 14 items for each of the 9 LGBTQ groups clustered around 6 key areas. 1. Social and familial relationships. 2. Positions of importance and social significance. 3. Basic human rights. 4. Sex-related stigma. 5. Identity permanence. And 6. The achievement of femininity or masculinity. The independent variables are as followed. Hetero-cis normativity. Wharton's work includes 6 items with response options on a 5-point scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. 1. Is it okay to think negatively about people who are gay or lesbian because it's not normal to be gay or lesbian? 2. Is it okay to think negatively about people who are bisexual because it is not normal to be bisexual? 3. Is it okay to think negatively about transgender people because it is not normal to be transgender? 4. Is it okay to think negatively about people who are queer because it is not normal to be queer? 5. Is it okay to think negatively about people who are non-binary or genderqueer because it is not normal to be non-binary or genderqueer? 6. I don't think anyone should be gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer, non-binary, or genderqueer. The next independent variable is rurality. Respondents were asked, how would you describe the town/city you spent the majority of your life, with response options being 1. Rural, 2. Small town, 3. Suburbs of a large city, or 4. A large city. The last independent variable is gender. Respondents were asked, what best describes your gender, with the following responses. 1. I identify as a man and my sex assigned at birth was male. 2. I identify as a woman and my sex assigned at birth was female. 3. I identify as a man and my sex assigned at birth was female. 4. I identify as a woman and my sex assigned at birth was male. 5. I am gender non-binary, gender fluid, or gender queer. This table shows all of the options along with the responses in percentages. Next, we have social demographic controls, which is past work has demonstrated significant relationships between social demographics and LGBTQ attitudes. And this study does include sexual identity, racial ethnic identity, education, and age as social demographic controls, as we see along the bottom of this table. We then have the method of analysis. In the first set of analyses, the mean values of the LGBTQ stigma scales were compared for the rural versus non-rural group, and the rural men versus rural women using t-test. In the second set of analyses, OLS regressions were used to explore the effects of the HCN scales, rurality and gender on the LGBTQ stigma scales. Our results. The T-table results in the main table, in table to the main values for the HCN scale, the LGBTQ stigma scales were compared by rurality and gender. For the first set of T-tests, results indicated that people who spent the majority of their life in a rural area reported significantly greater levels of hetero-cis normativity than non-rural people. Moreover, rural men reported significantly higher levels of hetero-cis normativity than rural women. For the second set of T-tests, results indicated that people who spent the majority of their life in a rural area were significantly more stigmatized towards LGBTQ people than non-rural people are across all 9 scales. In addition, results indicated that rural men are significantly more stigmatized towards queer people than rural women across all 9 scales. The OLS regression results said that across all tables, the HCN scale is positively related to the stigmatization of all 9 groups of LGBTQ people, fully supporting hypothesis 1. In addition, looking at the tables, rurality is positively related to stigma towards gay men, bisexual women, bisexual men, trans women, and queer men, but only approaches significance for stigmatization towards queer women. Being a cis man compared to a cis woman is also positively related to the stigmatization of all 9 LGBTQ groups across all tables. Last, we have the discussion. The current study examines the relationship between gender, rurality, and LGBTQ stigma through the lens of hetero-cis normativity violations and norm-centered stigma theory. 2 of the 3 NCST hypotheses were at least partially supported through the results. This would be hypothesis 1 and hypothesis 2A. While hypothesis 2B was not supported at any model, together the findings from the current study demonstrate a complex relationship between gender, rurality, and LGBTQ stigma, which may be related to the ways that some groups view hetero-cis normativity violations.